It is my pleasure to introduce Professors Peggy Cooper-Davis and Khalil Gibran Mohammed to you this evening. Professor Davis joined the NYU Law faculty in September of 1983 after having served for 3 years as a judge of the Family Court of the State of New York and having engaged in the practice and administration of law during the preceding 10 years. She has published 2 books and more than 50 articles and book chapters, most notably in the premier journals of Harvard, Yale, NYU, and Michigan law schools. Her scholarship has influenced the critique and evolution of legal pedagogy. She has developed learning strategies for addressing interpretive, interactive, ethical, and social dimensions of legal practice through her work with the Experiential Learning Lab, and has served as chair of the board of the Russell Sage Foundation and as a director of numerous not-for-profit, for-profit, and government entities. Along with Professor Davis, we have Professor Khalil Gibran Mohammed, no stranger to many of you, as he is a neighbor and tremendous friend of the coalition. Khalil is a professor of history, race, and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. He is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library. Before leading the Schomburg Center, Khalil was an associate professor at Indiana University. His scholarship examines the broad intersections of race, democracy, inequality, and criminal justice in modern US history. Much of his work has been featured in national print and broadcast media outlets, including the New York Times, New Yorker, Washington Post, The Nation, National Public Radio, Moyers and Company, and MSNBC. He has appeared in a number of feature-length documentaries, including the Oscar-nominated 13th in 2016 and Slavery by Another Name in 2012. In 2017, he received the Distinguished Service Medal from Columbia University Teachers College. He holds 2 honorary doctorates and serves on several boards, including the Vera Institute of Justice, the Museum of Modern Art, and the New York Historical Society, just to name a few. Khalil is an award-winning teacher at Harvard and has received numerous honors for his commitment to public engagement. He is a community treasure and was also recently honored by the Coalition on Race this past October for his commitment to racial integration and equity. We are honored to have such talent with us this evening. I would like to now turn the program over to Professor Mohammed.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Carol. I have to give you all the shortened version of that bio. Certainly a bit much for the hometown crowd. As always, really delighted to support the Coalition Community on Race. Ever since Ferguson in 2014, for the first time in my life, it really struck me how the absence of a social infrastructure, such as what CCR represents, can make a huge difference in how a community responds to crisis. And so unlike what was present in Ferguson, at a level of scale and intensity, this community is well protected by the work of all of you and continuing to bring people together to deal with difficult issues and topics in preparation, or I should say, in a way of being well prepared for the worst. And so I'm grateful to return. Tonight's extra special for me because I am joined this evening by a dear mentor, a colleague in the broadest sense, and most especially a dear family friend. If it were not for Peggy, that is Professor Davis, there's a good chance I would never have gotten the job at the Schomburg Center. So that's, she's shaking her head, but she knows why I said that. In any case, you are in for a treat because so much of the misinformation that exists in this moment about what critical race theory is depends in large part by not actually dealing with the facts as we know them, and for the people who have helped to establish this way of understanding the world. So I'll stop with my introductory comments and give Peggy a chance to say hello, and then we'll jump into, we're going to basically have a conversation, and I'm going to encourage her to ask me as many questions as I have lined up to ask her, but we're going to try to make this as informal and useful as possible. So Peggy, I'll hand it over to you for a moment.
Thank you. For just a moment. First of all, thank you, Khalil, for this invitation. You know, as this debate about CRT has been swirling around, it's been frustrating because there's been so much misunderstanding and so much unnecessary alarm, I think. So I am delighted to be here and to be able to talk with people who are concerned about race in their community, about where this strange phenomenon came from and what it means and what it is.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to subject myself to your questioning, although I do it with some trepidation. I feel like the first day of law school again.
Oh, no. This is totally fun. Well, fun in the way that we have to use levity as a protective measure when dealing with difficult subject matter. So to make this really easy, let's start from the beginning. So you have been teaching and writing and engaging as a legal professional, as first a practitioner and as a professor for, in some ways, the arc of the story of critical race theory's beginnings. And so a lot of people may know of Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and a few others whose names are more prominent in terms of how people have come to understand what critical race theory is, but you were there at the beginning too. So help us understand how the idea evolved about how we understand the law, the social, economic, political foundations of the law. Just a simple, straightforward, here's my origin story of how I both contributed to and came to understand what we call critical race theory today.
Great. That's what I hoped you'd ask me. So you're always a good friend. And I think I'll begin a little bit before critical race theory was a term known to maybe anybody, but to many people for sure. And that is in the mid-60s. Because I think that it's appropriate to begin with the civil rights activity that was going on at that time. And I hope you'll forgive me if I make this pretty autobiographical.
No, I want it to
but
be.
I'm going to do it anyway. When I was in college, there was in the mid-60s, there was a new attention among people of my generation to social justice issues and to racial justice issues. So I think that people who went through college and law school at the time that I did were energized about those things. And many of us, myself included, went to law school in order to become civil rights lawyers because those were issues we cared deeply about. I finished law school in 1964. And at that time, there wasn't much talk of critical race theory. There was beginning to be talk of something called critical legal studies. And I think it was inevitable that the increasing number of people of color attending law schools became intrigued by and interested in the critical legal studies movement. And we began to do work of our own and study of our own that was related to that movement. And then began to break off as the critical race studies group, although it was never a complete break, because we were always allied with, although never always in a complete agreement with, critical legal studies folks. And at about the same time, women's groups began to do the same thing. They began to want to think critically about how the law evolves in reaction to and how it affects women. The racial and national and ethnic categories began to fragment so that we had several brands of
a cacophony of
yes,
critical groups,
yes, yes, yes. And I must say that for myself, it was always difficult to understand whether I was entitled to claim the name critical race theorist.
Mhm.
And that was in part because many of the folks, particularly those who had evolved through the critical legal studies movement, were working with, I have to say, esoteric and complex work in the social sciences and in philosophy. And many of us who felt allied with critical race theory I certainly felt ill-prepared to be in conversation with those people, although I always found being in conversation with them immensely helpful and informative. So critical legal studies folks some years later began to meet, and at about the time I began teaching in the 80s, there were annual meetings of people who called themselves, some hesitantly like me and some boldly, critical race theorists. And we wrote about a variety of things, but they all had to do about how questions of race were manifest in the evolution and development of laws and legal theory. And they all centered people of color more than folks in legal academia had centered people of color before.
Mhm.
And that's my sense of how the movement began.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Because I think I know there are lawyers in this community, and some of them will have experienced in their own journey some of what you described. But for those who are not, including myself, I understand critical legal theory to be a question about how elite decision makers within the legal profession stood in judgment of people, and more or less a class argument, a critique of the law, that the law could not be entirely a neutral arbiter of justice, because the interests of those who had always held the position of power to decide the fate of others was a particular demographic, usually of men of property. Is that fair as a kind of starting point for how critical legal theorists began to question how the law itself structured society?
It's fair, although there's a matter of emphasis that I don't think all of us would feel fully in accord with. there is a range from people who notice the evolution of law and notice how people of color are harmed or neglected by it, who don't so much emphasize the idea that there's a competition among classes, or that there is a suppression of one class by another. Although the idea of subordination, I think, runs through all of our work.
Mhm.
And we had all observed that communities of color were often subordinated and disadvantaged.
Yeah. So that's an interesting kind of object lesson. So takeaway number one.
Yes, yes.
Takeaway number
Right.
one is that just the nuance of Peggy's making the fine distinctions, both in critical legal theory and critical race theory, the kind of self-affirmation that I'm not sure that I even was a critical race theorist at the beginning, and most profoundly, that so much of this origin story is deeply embedded within legal cultures, gives us our first takeaway that critical race theory in schools has never been taught. So certainly in the way that we're describing it here. Now, I will come back to this because I do think there's a way to open up essentially a broader question about what does it mean to use history in the way that critical race theorists did. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. So if I could probe a little bit further, I was doing my own work around critical race theory in the midst of the national crisis. I have long used the term in my own teaching as a way to describe methods that my students will be exposed to. But again, here I am not a lawyer or working in a law school, because in some ways, the term itself represented a way of interrogating race at the core of all kinds of social phenomena. And in that regard, I want to come to a term that you introduce, or at least that you draw upon, in a 1989 article called Law as Microaggression. And so Peggy writes this article for the Yale Law Review in 1989. It's listed now as a kind of canonical article in critical race theory. So if you sort of Google, must read, you'll find it on many lists because people want people to go back and read the law professors who helped to establish this field. So talk to us about microaggressions, because everyone here knows what a microaggression is at this point. It's euphemism for all the terrible things that happen in terms of how people are treated, often short of something physical, and as you even say, can be very benign in their actual implications, but can feel like an assault. So you have the parable. I call it a parable, but it probably was an actual experience. I'm not sure. But tell the elevator story. You write beautifully about this elevator story to open up these questions for readers to understand what does it mean that people have this experience of microaggression, and the people who are the microaggressors, the implications of that for the legal profession.
Yeah. It actually was an account of something that really happened. I started teaching after having been a family court judge. And of course, the family court is an interesting place in terms of race and law. But it's a place where most of the respondents, indeed, most of the people who are brought to family court are people of few means and vast majority racial and ethnic minorities. So it was interesting for me to go into that environment as a judge, because I was racially misplaced, right? I was supposed to be one of the people appearing before the judges, not one of the judges. So I had a way of seeing things that I think lots of my colleagues did not have. So this particular incident was simply an incident in which a couple of courthouse regulars, legal professionals, observe a woman at an elevator, and there's some confusion about which way the elevator is going and whether to get on or not. And then there's a comment by one of these professionals about those people who just don't know anything and are inept always.
Can I clarify? I've read it recently. So what you say is that a Black woman approaches the elevator opens, and she asks the person on it, who happens to be a city attorney, is this elevator going up, which is the direction she wanted to go. And the woman says, no, it's going down. And as the elevator door closes, essentially says something to the effect, those people don't know anything.
Right.
So it's a snide aside, but you make meaning of it in the way that you analyze the moment.
Okay. Yeah, you're a better reporter of my work than I.
Yeah. So what are we to learn about why that and the city attorney who is somewhat, who makes the snide, what we might call microaggressive racist remark in reference to the Black woman, what does that tell us about how the legal profession itself ought to be paying attention to a culture that exists within it?
Well, you see, the city attorney was kind of assuming that people like the woman who asked the question sort of didn't know up from down and were inept and incompetent. And the city attorney has a position of certain power in a system in which people like the woman who asked whether the elevator was going up or down are at risk of losing their children, are at risk of having their families reconfigured, are at risk of being penalized for family offenses. So you immediately have a concern about how things go in that courthouse, where you have people being judged with very serious consequences by people who presume that most of the, we call them respondents, who appeared before us are inferior, not to be respected intellectually or sometimes morally.
Yeah. I'm going to quote something from the article because it's very powerful language, and I think it gets at kind of the work of critical race theory in the broadest sense. You say that what we learned from this exchange that might be otherwise dismissed as trivial and unimportant turns out to be the surface of a much deeper problem. And that deeper problem is a culture of racist ideas, of anti-Black racism. And you situate that culture in the 1980s, and I'm going to quote you directly because you say anti-Black attitudes persist in a climate of denial. And you talk at length about the way in which this city attorney, like so many others within the family court system, would have actively refused the label of being a racist or having a racist bone in their body, that these were, good people, and particularly in the New York setting, probably self-described liberals. And yet, what is underneath all of this is the continuation, what you call the cultural heritage of white Americans who have who essentially have understood Black people as more or less inferior to them. And you take it back to slavery, you say slavery required a system of beliefs that would rationalize white domination and laws and customs that would assure control of the slave population. This history is part of the cultural heritage of the city attorney. So it may feel like a lot of weight on the story, but I think part of what critical race theory was attempting to do in those early days was to find entryways into a larger reality of the psychology of racism and the structure of racism that the law on its face simply didn't afford access to. Is that fair, that this way of using stories that were real experiences opened up onto a history that would help people to see that these cultural heritages had life or death consequences within legal settings? As you say, people were passing judgment on family separation and so forth.
Yes, and I mean, I want to use this invitation to speak as a way to move to the concluding portion of the article, because a comment in an elevator seems trivial. Some might think that the muted predispositions of those who control the fates of people who are brought before family court are not of so much consequence. But I end the article by talking about a decision by the United States Supreme Court in which the court declined to give any relief in the face of overwhelming and careful statistical evidence that in the use of the death penalty, Blacks were discriminated against. So I wanted to show that something that looks trivial is, to repeat myself, a manifestation of something that permeates the legal system in ways that are ugly and in ways that need to be addressed.
Yeah, that's the Baldus study, for those who know it in other historical contexts, that proved indisputably that it was victimization that mattered in the application of death penalty. For white victims, overwhelmingly death penalty was applied, and Black victims much less so. And in both cases, when Blacks were the perpetrators, were more likely to receive the death penalty. And for a time, invalidated or at least created the conditions for a moratorium on death penalties, which were ultimately reversed and gave us what we currently have, which is the jurisprudence, essentially, that unless someone, that essentially disparity data alone is insufficient to prove discrimination in case law. One has to actually prove intent. And so that is critical race theory, folks. That's what we're talking about. And as you can imagine, within a legal setting, as Peggy described in certain contexts, can become very esoteric. But the stakes of those esoteric debates are life and death. And so let's open this up a little bit, because we've gotten a sense of the origins, the stakes of it, and the fact that this has taken place within the legal structure, but it did move outwardly. And I wanted to share kind of a personal anecdote. So Derek Bell is someone who I deeply admire, but I did not know personally. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, Peggy, and say that you did know Derek very well.
I did.
Yes. Aside from being connected to Harvard, but also at NYU. And in preparation for tonight, I went on my bookshelf to pull this book off, which I wanted to confirm because I wasn't sure of it, but you won't be able to read this, but there's a signature here, my signature for my book, and it's dated July 1st, 1993. So I read this book essentially the summer after I graduated from college. I wasn't even off to graduate school yet. And just for the record, I didn't go here, and you may not be able to see it because of blurring, but it's all marked up. So at some point, one of the leading pioneers of critical race theory wrote a book called Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism, and it crossed over into affecting someone like me, who at the time was 21 years old. And one of the passages that I have here, I'm going to read it briefly because I think that it helps us to think in the broadest sense how critical race theory became a very useful tool for broader conversations about structural racism, and how it has been a key feature of American society. So on page 8, he says, the critically important stabilizing role that Blacks play in this society constitutes a major barrier in the way of achieving racial equality. So Blacks play a stabilizing role in society, which then becomes a barrier to achieving racial equality. He said, throughout history, politicians have used Blacks as scapegoats for failed economic or political policies. Talks about slave owners persuading the white working class to stand with them against slave revolts. Talks about labor unions preferring to side with plant owners to break strikes with Black scab workers. Talks about a them versus us attitude, references whites thinking that affirmative action was taking things away from them, and concludes here that says, and yet conservative white politicians are able to gain and hold even the highest office despite their failure to address seriously any of the issues of inequality in society. They rely instead on the time-tested formula of getting needy whites to identify on the basis of their shared skin color and suggest with little or no subtlety that white people must stand together against the Willie Hortons or against racial quotas or against affirmative action. The code words differ, the message is the same. And I couldn't help but think of how prescient in 1993, this notion of weaponizing white people to think that Black people or Mexicans or immigrants are taking something from them that they have to defend against the problem of failed economic policies that have produced tremendous inequality and stratification in our society. So, what do you think about the echo? I mean, for you, having lived through this early moment and now see it, how do you make sense of the backlash to CRT?
Okay. I mean, first, I'm inclined to want to position myself with respect to Derek.
Yep.
Because as you said, I certainly did know him. He was my colleague at NYU and someone I admired deeply and miss terribly. I have to say that when Derek and I talked with each other about our work, there was a certain amount of disagreement. I would write about things like, gee, the story of Reconstruction and the story that the 14th Amendment was meant to create conditions of liberty, not just for former slaves, but for all Americans, is a story that ought to inform the Supreme Court's interpretation of the idea of liberty in our Constitution. And I tried to be insistent about that. And Derek would say to me, why do you do that? Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, why do you write things like that? And I think it's because he believed or feared that people had to remain in struggle against racism, but that it was probably a permanent condition.
You saw, can I pick up that thread? You saw the 14th Amendment as a legacy of the struggle against slavery,
Yes,
as a kind of prophylactic against future abuses or degradation of Black life or Asian life or women's rights, that it was something that would always be there for the possibility and or the deployment of rights-based freedom struggles. You
well,
wanted,
yes, and the court's opinion in the Dobbs case belies that, doesn't it?
yeah, and you've written a lot about that recently. Please share, because part of what I think this is may feel like a tangent, but I think people are really interested in the connections you make. The privacy issue that you say becomes part of the package of rights that happened after the Civil War is precisely what the Dobbs decision erodes. And you can't understand it without understanding the Black freedom struggle in that moment. So you can give our audience a taste of some of what you've been writing in The Economist and other places about this issue.
No, it's kind of you to give me that platform. I'm not sure I deserve it, but it is important to me that the 14th Amendment in particular was meant to be a charter of liberty, and read together with the 13th and 15th. It was not only to empower people who actually had been enslaved, but could easily be interpreted, and I think should be interpreted, as a national commitment to a certain measure of liberty and freedom and entitlement to political participation. In other words, that people could not be enslaved, but had to function as free, not at complete liberty, of course, but within limits of responsibility, free political and social agents.
Mm-hmm.
And I raise that argument now and put it beside my discouragement after the Dobbs opinion.
Mm-hmm.
To say that, Derek had a powerful point.
Mm-hmm.
Why do I keep insisting on these things?
Yeah.
I
can tell you why you do it. Because,
okay.
well, you do it because these parallel histories of racial progress and retrenchment can both appear as if it's a loop that we can't escape, which is the argument that you're saying Derek articulated, and it certainly is one that he's known for in terms of the argument of the permanence of racism. But at the same time, you're saying that the preconditions for that liberation are baked in. And so the resistance to the backlash against CRT is also a resistance to us knowing that we have the basis for those claims to make, that the argument can be made, that the argument is constitutional, and we have to make it in spite of how dour things look, despite how dark the clouds are, and despite the political weaponization of the court itself. We still ought to fight for what you've described here as this charter of liberty.
I just wish I could take you with me everywhere.
Well,
you make the point so much better than I.
No, I can't make any points without learning from you.
Mm.
So we've covered a lot of the kind of main goals of at least defining it, giving some context for the backlash. I tried to tell it in that story that Derek Bell gives, which to me is essentially the same story, which is a certain class of political elites are masking the circumstance, the economic bankruptcy of failed policies, call it racial resentment, or economic grievances, and using any number of racialized peoples as scapegoats for these problems. And so what's not happening in our classrooms in terms of teaching about these histories, you can't have a debate either in law school or anywhere else about critical race theory or the application of structural racism without understanding the history. Those two things are inseparable. So I think in the interest of time, we're going to let our facilitators take over so that the groups can have discussion, and we'll come back out and we'll clarify a few more things before the evening's over, and everyone will have their marching orders to go out and fight this madness that is happening. All right?
That's a tall order.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to our speakers. You'll see on the screens our guidelines for our breakout rooms. We do ask that in your breakout rooms that to create a community feel, we are conversations on race after all, please turn on your camera so that you can see your neighbors and your community members. And in order to do that, you will see that there is an icon of a video camera at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining from a phone or an iPad, it might be hidden, but just click on that or tap on that icon of a video camera. We ask that one person speaks at a time with no interruptions, and no one should dominate a conversation. We ask that you keep it on the eye and please speak from your personal experience rather than generalizing. The breakout rooms will not be recorded. We do invite you to speak freely, although our excellent hosts tonight, Professor Mohammed and Professor Cooper Davis, may be flipping in and out of your rooms just because they're interested in what you have to say. So if they join you, consider them flies on your virtual wall. They are just observing. We're going to go into rooms. You will be in groups of 8 or 9-ish. Sometimes we have people who have to leave after the presentations. We recognize that. We strive to make the rooms as even as possible. If there are any rooms that are very small, we'll try to shuffle folks around. You'll have a facilitator who will be designated by the letters FAC in their name. And here are our questions for you to consider in your groups this evening. First, what were your thoughts about CRT before tonight? Do you still adhere to those thoughts? Share any changes in your perceptions. Are your thoughts aligned with what you learned tonight? And second, do you think it is important to teach true history in schools? Why is this still controversial in some communities? So we'll put these questions in the chat. Your facilitators also have a copy of them, and we'll make sure that you're able to access them as well. And I will go ahead and put those just in the chat now so that you have them before I release you into your breakout rooms. Bear with me here. All right. Your goal, and your facilitators are aware of this, your goal in your rooms are to come away after your 30-minute discussion with one key takeaway or one key question. And for that reason, we ask that you designate in your groups someone to be a recorder and a reporter so that that person can give that one key takeaway or one question that the group still has after tonight's presentation. So now you have the information in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing. And in just one moment, you will be whisked into your breakout rooms. And enjoy your conversations, folks. There it is. All right. So I'm going to keep us on this gallery view for the short term, and then we're going to call on various groups, and I'm going to call the groups by the group number and also the name of the facilitator, but we'd like the person who volunteered to be the reporter to step up to give us your takeaways. So I'm going to start right in the middle of our numbers, and I'm going to start with room 6, and the facilitator for that room was Reverend Dr. Pritchett. So whoever is the reporter for room 6 with Dr. Pritchett, please tell us your takeaway or your question from your conversations.
So you only want one takeaway?
I'm sure you have many. Let's start with one, Janice. I would appreciate that. And then if we can, we'll add them in.
So in that case, I'd like to say that how our reluctance to do the truth telling that needs to be done, what a disservice it is to our children.
You look like you were just about to add something, so I wanted to give you space. Thank you for that. I appreciate that, Janice. It's very, very concise. Thank you. Okay, let's go now to room 7. The facilitator for room 7 was Jane Perry. Who was the reporter for Jane's room?
That's me, Perry Smilo. I would say that one of our takeaways was how lucky we are in the state of New Jersey to have embedded in all of our curricula, the Amistad curriculum, and embedded in law, Holocaust curriculum, et cetera, and that we feel very lucky. And we do have a question, essentially, which is we're hoping we can prompt Khalil to say a few words at some point about his latest podcast regarding textbooks. We were curious to learn more about that and how it interfaces with the question of critical race theory.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Perry, and room 7. Now we'll go to room 5. The facilitator for room 5 was Ed Stewart. Who's the reporter for room 5?
Hi, Toya Tracy. I'm the reporter for room 5. We had a very good discussion. I think our key takeaway, and it started towards the end of the conversation, was just the importance of talking about true history in school and using the right terminology with our children and ensuring that that is part of the curriculum in the school system.
Toya, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, now we'll go to room 8. The facilitator for room 8 was Kristen Lazanti. Who's the reporter for Kristen's room?
Hi, I'm Sharon Pigeon.
Please.
So we had some good discussion in our room, and a couple of us had sort of changed our thinking or learned about the connection and the origins to the legal arena. I think the bulk of our discussion was talking about the words critical race theory, in particular critical, and how many meanings of critical there are and what does that really mean. And given that all 3 of those words are such loaded words, and given that we're really talking about being able to teach history and facts, maybe theory isn't really the appropriate word because it's just too loaded and gives people an opportunity to kind of dismiss that and misinterpret and bend that in ways that they really shouldn't.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to room 4. The facilitator for room 4 was Diane Thompson. And who would like to report for the room that Diane was facilitating?
That's me. Hi, Isis Fabian. I'll just speak to one point we coalesced around as we got into, similar to the last room, the conversation on critical race theory. We're talking about why is it called a theory? Why are we using, still treating this as if it's like a debatable thing? And then we talked about, when you use the plain language, it intimidates people, it scares people. And what we've seen throughout history, going back to the 14th Amendment, but in many different instances, things get dialed back because something is working and they didn't want it to work anymore. And so that's a quote from someone in our group. And so always navigating that tension of really shifting the tide, things getting better, people in power getting scared, getting intimidated, and then trying to shut things down, kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Spent a lot of time on that.
Thank you, Isis. Now I'm going to skip to room 3. Room 3 was facilitated by Barbara Velasquez. Barbara, and the reporter for Barbara's room?
As I totally forgot to get a to assign a reporter. I guess that's me.
By default, yes.
I think, well, there were 2 close ones, but I think that the main one really interesting takeaway was stepping down the critical race theory to present it at the level of K to 12. K to 12? Yes, K to 12. Well, of course, critical race theory is developed at a college level. There are things that came out of it, like to be, aware of, go into the second question about should things be taught in the schools, the truth be taught in the schools. I think the 2 of them work together very well. And critical race theory, I think, is apparent for a whole lot of different issues that we've become aware of lately, like systemic racism, institutional racism, and so forth. And we had a question, though we have some idea of the answer, but maybe to go more deeply, is why can't people see what's on in front of their nose? If people are saying that there's racism in the criminal justice system, and we have proof, and we see that, and we can, all kinds of statistics, how can you possibly deny it? It exists, I mean, there's proof, but there's something going on. And I'm sure we all know what it is, but to be able to see more deeply into that question of why can't they just accept things like critical race theory? Why are people going out of their minds over it?
Barbara, thank you so much. Now I'm going to move to the reporter from room 9. That's the room that was facilitated by Larry Petricaro. Room 9.
Hi, I'm Kina. I'm reporting out for our group.
Thanks, Kina.
You're welcome. So part of what we discussed around CRT was how it's been a manipulated tool. That was a trend of what it is that we've talked about in today's conversations, and that we absolutely thought that it is important to teach true history. We had conversation around that. A question that we had towards the end of our discussion was, do you think there is a path forward, or what would the process look like for the United States to take up accountability for its history in the same way that Germany has?
Thank you, Kina. Now I'm going to move to room 2, which was facilitated by Antoine Green. Could I ask that the reporter for Antoine Green's room report out?
Yes, that would be me. First, I would like to thank my group, because my group were the true facilitators, as I was in frozen in limbo. So thank you guys, but I did take the notes. One of the things that we looked at was the difference in regards to a community like South Orange, Maplewood, where we're having this type of discussion with groups, and being grateful for the opportunity to do that in comparison to some other places around the country where these types of conversations are not held. And we also talked about the need for honesty and transparency in schools. We talked about being able to now look back on some things that were microaggressions previously, and again the importance of being woke in terms of what's going on and being able to share information. Well, one of the questions that we had was how do we share resources, information and resources with different communities where they don't have an opportunity to have these discussions, where they're in school systems where books are being banned, and where the school boards are being controlled.
Antoine, thank you so much. Now we're going to move to room 10, which was facilitated by Rhea Beck, and the person who was the reporter for that group.
We also neglected to identify someone, so I'm just going to let somebody from my group jump in, please. Go for it, Sylvia. I see you. Max, are you interested in reporting out for the group? All right, I guess not. Well, all right. In the interest of time, I think one of the things that came up in our group discussion was what Max and Patrick and Zia and Sylvia and Kimberly identified as the kind of misapplication of what CRT really is in the popular context. And there was a lot of robust discussion about why that might be the case and who benefits from that kind of misdirection. You know, whether it's about fear or demographic change or, you know, a concern about preserving a sense of innocence, all of that good stuff. So we had about 20 minutes of our conversation dedicated to, you know, what CRT means in the academic sense versus how most of us engage with and understand CRT in the way that it's sort of been introduced in the popular culture and who benefits from that.
Rhea, thank you. Last but absolutely not least, we have room 1, which was facilitated by Abigail Kotler. Could I ask the reporter from Abby's room to step forward? Is that you, Jill?
That's me, yes.
Go ahead.
Well, our group, we had several people who had experience in different countries and different cultures. And what we noticed was that racism was so much stronger felt in the United States than in many other countries. And, you know, wondering why that is, we kind of feel like it's part of the history. It's the history of colonization and the history certainly of slavery. So there's no way to change what we have unless we discuss that history in schools. But also, you know, education is really not enough to change it. It is connected to the law, and we kind of learned that from our presenters earlier.
Thank you very much, Jill, and thanks to everyone. I know that folks had a lot to say, and now I want to turn it over to our amazing speakers, and perhaps they'll, in their closing remarks, be able to address some of your questions, and then we'll do some Q&A so that you'll have opportunity to ask any questions that you didn't yet get to ask.
Thanks so much, Tegan. So I'm curious, Peggy, did you hear a question that you wanted to jump in on? Either sort of how to make sense of the backlash, what is it about? Why is it so hard for people to wrestle with these histories? The question about Germany and its efforts at making sure that no one ever forgets the Holocaust, particularly since the 1980s. It wasn't always the case in Germany. They were a little bit late to acknowledging it. So I'll hand it to you, Peggy, to share any thoughts or reflections you had given what we just heard from everyone. Uh-oh, you're muted.
Now I'm not muted. Thank you, Khalil. It was enlightening to listen. And, you know, having sat in on very interesting discussion and then having listened to the summaries of the several discussions, there's a question that's kind of lingered for me. And it is, Khalil, that I want to question the idea, or I want to ask people to consider what we mean by true history. And I'm also intrigued that people were interested in the use of the word critical. And I want to put those two ideas together. And I want to argue that there is no true history. That there are versions of history and understandings of history. And that what critical theory and critical race theory have tried to do is point out that histories can be retold and told differently, and to invite people to consider other perspectives on history. So I want to suggest that maybe the argument of those of us who were in the critical race theory camp is that there isn't any true history and that we all should be open to different perceptions of history, and particularly open to the perceptions of those who might have been abused by it.
Yeah, I appreciate that nuance. I think if I could speak on behalf of the group, their use of true history was an attempt to say a more accurate history. I mean, there are some facts about the past that are simply completely erased or distorted beyond recognition, and particularly in a time when misinformation, disinformation are so blatantly obvious to us. I just so happen, as someone asked in reference to a podcast that came out today, that the title of the episode is "How Textbooks Made America Not So Great." and tongue in cheek, it's an interview with my co-host and a guest who has written a book called Teaching White Supremacy. And the body of work that this author has engaged has been looking at hundreds of textbooks from the 1800s to the 1980s, essentially telling a story of a heroic nation whose manifest destiny allowed it to grow from sea to shining sea, and all the people in the middle be damned because they were only meant to be in the service of wealth creation, so on and so forth. This is a paraphrase. So I think in the context of the conversation we've had tonight, I think people are saying we at least need to be honest about the facts of settler colonialism, of chattel slavery, of the context of Jim Crow, while we might continue, as you so rightly point out, make sense of how to interpret the totality of those facts. I'll be the first to admit that the nation's origin story is so deeply flawed that it has produced the society that we struggle with. At the same time, if we were to replace the nation's current origin story with a new one, it would still be an origin story. It would still be a form of myth making. I just think if we want to have a society that is more egalitarian, we're going to need a new origin story, a new myth of some kind or another. I wanted to share two quick things, and then Peggy, I'll turn it back to you if you wanted to share some final thoughts for our evening. One is a quote by Toni Morrison, and it came up just in both in the discussion I was listening to, but also very much the context of this conversation we're having. And the quote is, and I'm paraphrasing, that racism is designed to keep you distracted, to keep you constantly defending your humanity. And it seems to me that that quote so aptly describes the whole point of turning something that, as you, Peggy, so rightly described, was a debate among scholars within the legal profession about how to make sense of different experiences that were not captured either in the curriculum of law school or that the law itself could adequately account for these differences, has metastasized into this bugbear of anti-whiteness. And the second quote that I'm going to read is one from the person who we are to credit with the so-called backlash, or actually the backlash to so-called critical race theory. And here is that quote. So the man's name is Christopher Rufo. He's a Seattle-based quasi-journalist, to put it as generously as I can. And here is what he said. We have successfully frozen their brand, quote unquote, critical race theory into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. And so it could become all things that reflect critiques of power in American society, of privileges that white people on average enjoy in a society that is so fundamentally racially stratified, and essentially became a way to say any critique of white America or white Americans or of the power arrangements that exist in our society is critical race theory, and it's bad. We shouldn't do it, and those people are the enemies. And so Toni Morrison's notion that racism is designed to keep you distracted, to keep you constantly defending your humanity, to me is one of the most resonant and prophetic observations about what it is that keeps happening in this conversation. So that's all I got, folks. Peggy, you wanna take it away?
Well, first I want to thank you. It's always such a pleasure to have an exchange with you, and I always learn from you. So thank you. And I want to pick up your word critique. And I want to go back to my fixation on the word critical. And I want to suggest that those who have tried to demonize critical race theory have in mind something that they would call a true history. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea of being empowered to think critically and to critique that history is an idea that frees us to tell it differently. Mm-hmm. And I think that's empowering. And I hope we all feel open to that, even though critical is kind of an ugly word.
Well, thank you, Peggy. I'm going to hand it back to our organizers. Thanks so much. And if we have time, I guess we'll take more questions, but I'll leave it to you based on your goals for the remainder of our time.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to look to Nancy for our time to see if we are able to take a few questions. Nancy, can you unmute and let us know?
Yep, I'm unmuting. I think we could take maybe one or two questions, and then we have a few closing thoughts, so we want to have time to get to those and not have people leave us too late. So if there's a burning question or two out there, we should take those and then we'll close for the evening.
Great, Nancy, thank you so much. I see two hands up. We're going to start with LM Carter. LM Carter, thank you so much. Please unmute and share your question with our speakers.
Hi, this has been really good. I appreciate it. Just real quick, something to think about. You may not be able to answer, but I think Khalil talked about race is a diversion. And I said, isn't it critical? I mean, isn't it essential to a capitalist system to have diversions so that people don't pay attention to our conditions?
Well, that's an easy one for me.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, just to extend a quick point, I mean, sort of the angst that we experience in why would they do this is very much about power arrangements and our ability, as I think Peggy reminds us, to be critical of those power arrangements, to imagine different arrangements. However, they might reinscribe other forms of inequality, which may be the inescapable problem of humanity. Nevertheless, we have that choice. We can rearrange things. So thank you.
Thank you. Next on my screen with a hand up is Diane Hughes. Diane?
I actually think there was someone before me. Yeah.
Okay, Osa, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you, you two. I just really appreciate your willingness to speak. My question is actually directed at Professor Muhammad. I wanted to know, just particularly because you read, or rather you wrote Condemnation of Blackness. I'm just really fascinated by how a lot of what we see in terms of the criminalization, or I guess you could say, the way that the way we pathologize Black people in terms of crime versus the way we medicalize drug addiction in, maybe non-Black communities. I wondered if critical race theory has any say as to, well, I imagine that it does have a say, but I wonder how how that plays into making, I guess, other newly white people white. Like, I wonder how critical race theory interprets how, whether it be the Irish or Italians, Jewish Americans, were gradually coalesced into a super majority through critical race theory. Like, how does interest convergence connect to that, is really what I'm asking.
You got a lot going on there in that question. And that's great. It's exciting. I can't speak for, my humility dictates at this moment that I can't speak for how critical race theorists, capital CRT, make sense of racial criminalization and the shifting lines of identity between who's a real criminal and who's not. I can tell you as a historian that generally the body of work that explains that phenomenon is whiteness studies. And whiteness studies simply argues that that the shifting category of whiteness is itself a social construction. So many people of a certain generation were taught that race attaches to non-white subjects. But whiteness studies, and very much led by white historians and other social scientists, said white is also a racial category. Whiteness is an identity, and perhaps the most important identity in the language of identity politics to explain how things work. And in that sense, the shifting category of criminality is revealing how whiteness gets made. And so groups that had been previously defined as not white, as a category of lower Europeans, whether they were of Irish ancestry or Italian or Southern and Eastern Europeans, gradually were subsumed within the white category, partly out of their own political struggle, something they demanded, as well as the way in which racialization worked. By adopting anti-Black racial attitudes and supporting anti-Black policy, these liminal populations of working class and immigrant whites or white ethnics gained a measure of social capital as well. And there's tons of work on that, from Du Bois to David Roediger to other scholars who have written a lot about whiteness studies. So I think there's an intersection in CRT, but I will let Peggy describe that one, since she's our resident expert for the evening.
No, I think you've done a magnificent job of responding to the question. I have nothing to add.
Thank you both. And now we'll move to Diane.
Okay, thank you both. I was curious, this actually was a question that someone else raised, and I was very interested in your answer, regardless of whether we call it critical race theory. But what do you, with all the kind of proposals on the books to ban certain kinds of discussions, like discussing race has to be at the individual level, you're not allowed to discuss it at the structural level. What do you see as the way forward for those of us who are invested in having a different or modified version of history taught to kids in schools?
Well, this is a group that's interested in education and particularly interested in primary and secondary education. And I have to say that I'm entirely sympathetic with the idea that one would want to shy away from a term that's been or a brand that's been poisoned as critical race theory has. But what I would say about education is that you want children to become critical thinkers. And you might have to find another word because critical has been poisoned. But you want them to become critical thinkers. And that's why one of the first things I wanted to say after the wonderful discussions that you all have had is that you want to develop young people who will challenge whatever history you throw up at them and who will seek out facts and perspectives and construct their own.
And I don't have anything to add other than there are, there's been a discussion about whether or not the Amistad Commission is binding in the chat. And last I checked, it isn't binding. And so school districts have voluntarily tried to incorporate its findings. The reason I use this, coming back to this point, is that the question of what to do is very much a political choice for school districts, very local school districts, to make a decision about whether or not their curriculum meets standards of historical accuracy that would change the way students understand even how to be critical about our national myths and narratives. Most schools have only socialized children to accept a linear narrative of the nation's founding. And AP students get a better job of this than students who are in regular, between 7th and 10th grade. But I think this is a political choice. And so that's the fight. That's why on the right, they've been winning in red states.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we do have one more question from the floor, and that will be our final question of the evening. Fred?
Fred, you're muted.
I was in the group that discussed the use of the word critical in this context. So I was very interested in hearing Professor Davis explicate that to some degree, because and it's interesting because the use of the word critical as in critiquing or being critical of something was not a meaning that anybody in our group thought applied to critical race theory. We thought perhaps it meant critical as in important, or critical as everybody ought to know about this. But I think that it's the term itself that lends itself to abuse by, for example, that so-called journalist that you talked about. Since people have so much difficulty understanding what it means, they can pour into it anything they want, usually nefarious. And that's a real problem. Now, I'm just going to suggest that you two are steeped in this, so you know exactly what it means. But if it was difficult for people in our group to know that, it might be good to start out with what the word critical means in this context. Because otherwise it sounds like, oh, this is an important theory. It's so critical. You other folks who aren't elite ought to know about it. And that's the kind of meaning that some people are interpreting this as. And I just think that has to be part of the conversation going forward.
I think that's great advice. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it too. And I think, I mean, one of the things I think being an outsider to the legal profession and the practice of the law is how much the law depends on the appearance of stability. You know, we hear a lot about the rule of law. I wrote an academic article last year called "The Foundational Lawlessness of the Law Itself." Because for me, the critical intervention was to point out that an outlaw culture mostly defined how the law was used to justify conquest and theft. And that in no moral universe did any of this make sense other than the law of conquest. But we could just as well describe that as an outlaw culture rather than one that we think protects us and is stable and secure. But to your point, Fred, that's an act of a critical intervention, whatever label we might give it.
Thank you. And now I'll turn things over to Nancy to wrap us up. Nancy?
Great. I hope everybody hangs out with us for these last few minutes of housekeeping. First, I can't thank Professor Khalil Muhammad and Professor Peggy Cooper Davis enough for being with us tonight. This is such an important conversation, one that we wanted to have for a long time. And it took a little effort to get us a date and everything going, but we're here tonight and we're so grateful for your time, knowledge, and expertise. For everyone who's still here, I'm going to say a few more things, but I want to just highlight the fact that you're going to receive an evaluation form as we close out, and we really take your comments seriously in our planning. So please, everyone from facilitators to presenters, to participants, please fill out that evaluation form. It will help us in our planning. I want to thank the schools committee, the facilitators, everybody who was involved, Tegan and Audrey, who put so much work into this as well. Our upcoming events, we have an event on November 29th called Deconstructing Racism. It's an introduction to a workshop series that will take place in 2023. So if you want to continue these kinds of conversations, this is a really great opportunity for you. For those of you who have been following and are interested in how our town's demographics have changed over time, especially in the 25 years that the coalition has been doing its integration, equity, and inclusion work in both South Orange and Maplewood, we are presenting the first of what will be a few reports, but the first big report based on the 2020 census about on December 7th. Both of these events, by the way, are virtual, and you can register for them on our website. We have a lot of good information about diversity and integration overall in the towns, how we compare to other communities, and at the block group level even. So please register for those. Those of you who had other ideas for other topics for conversations on race and coffeehouse discussions, we welcome your thoughts and ideas for these ongoing conversations in 2023. Conversations on race will be back in the spring, but we have smaller discussions like this called coffeehouse discussions. Please share with us your concerns, emerging issues in the community. We want to be able to follow those things. And we also ask you to visit our website, and if you have the means and are so inclined, please consider a donation. Donations help us run programs like this, and we want to be able to bring as many of them out to you as possible. Thank you all for giving up your time tonight, or participating, joining us. And again, Khalil and Peggy, we really can't thank you enough. This was so enlightening.
Thanks for having us.